It's episode 223 of the Author Stories Podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Today's show is with Richard Fox. I'd like to tell you about some sponsors that I'm very happy to have today. Pico's House. Authors, if you're looking to take your book to the next level, you need to talk to my friend Crystal Pico Watanabe from Pico's House. She offers developmental editing, line editing, beta reading, and proofreading. She will soon be launching a book interior design service, print formatting, but you can inquire about that now if you're interested. She's edited over 70 novels and novellas and 130 short stories, and she comes recommended by best-selling authors such as Hugh Howey and Samuel Peralta. Most of her experiences with science fiction, speculative fiction, and middle-grade fantasy, but she enjoys all genres and would love to talk to you about your book project. She offers complimentary 2-page sample edits and complimentary track changes review after the edit. Visit picoshouse.com and let her know that you heard about it on Author Stories, and she'll give you a discount. That's PIKKOSHOUSE.com. Galactic Satori Chronicles, written by Nick Breaker and Paul E. Hicks, is a raucous sci-fi adventure introducing Asher, a young man whose world is turned upside down when he discovers that his fiance's death has been directly caused by an imminent alien invasion. He and his friends channeled his anger and grief into the ultimate weapon against alien technology. Human emotions were the one thing the Kron didn't account for when they started their attack on Earth. Book 1 Earth and Book 2 Kron are now available. Galactic Satori Chronicles. ThirdScribe.com has recently released their newest update, and it is amazing. Authors, you need a platform to showcase your work and to connect with readers. Readers, I know that you like to connect with your favorite authors. ThirdScribe is the place to do that. Go visit ThirdScribe.com, check out the all-new features, and give it a shot. ThirdScribe.com. There's a new anthology coming out called Oceans, the anthology put together by our very good friend Daniel Arthur Smith. If you remember Clones from last year, it's in the same series, The Frontiers of Speculative Fiction. You can pre-order it right now for 99 cents. This book is amazing, and not just because I have a story in it, although I do. 12 different authors bringing you speculative fiction, underwater cities, lost civilizations, crops, climate change, and dead zones. In this collection of ocean-themed stories, 12 of today's top speculative fiction writers explore our morality, our built-in societal restraints, and reflect upon our state of grace. The waves roll in, the waves roll out. Oceans, the anthology. Pre-order it now. It releases September 26th, but you can get it for only 99 cents if you go pre-order now. There's a link in the show notes. Every Thursday, I read cool comics in my collection. It comes out from Ed Gosney at edgosney.com with over 100 episodes in Ed's collection to date. There's always something new every week to point out something about comics that I didn't know. He highlights what he's collecting now, maybe some things he collected in the past, and always has a great story tied around them. Go check out cool comics in my collection at edgosney.com. Tears of Heaven, Flames of Perdition, Book 1 by R.A. McCandless. A child of angels and demons, Dell is a sarcastic, fast-talking, dangerous, and unpredictable demon hunter. She and her partner Marin take their orders directly from an angel. They obey or they'll be destroyed. It's not the job Dell wants, but it's the job she has. Normally, banishing a rogue demon back to hell wouldn't be a problem. Dell and Marin have a few centuries of experience. It's all part of the job description. But when the angel orders them to take down 3 demons at once, the job goes from bad to worse. The demons, with supernatural powers and their own agenda, have kidnapped children for their own nefarious ends. With angels breathing down her neck, children to save, and demons gunning for her blood, Dell is running out of time. That's exactly where she wants to be. If you're a fan of the Dresden Files, give Tears of Heaven, Flames of Perdition, Book 1 a shot by R.A. McCandless. Stay tuned after the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series. Thanks for listening. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to bring you an interview with Richard Fox. Richard is just coming off of a win at the Dragon Awards for Best Military Sci-Fi or Fantasy book for his book Iron Dragoons, and I'm really excited to. I think we actually had this lined up before Dragon Con, but it's so cool to get to talk to you right after that. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Thanks for having me, Hank. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and we're going to get into all that good stuff in a minute, but I have to start the show with the same question I always start with, and that is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
The earliest one, I loved Star Wars since before I could walk, but I didn't really have any intention of writing Star Wars. But years later, I was watching a movie called Darkman. Are you familiar with that one? Old Liam Neeson movie? There's a time at the end of the movie, and this is going to make me sound really dark that I don't think I am, but there's a point at the end of the movie where the main character is holding the guy who has ruined his entire life by the ankle in the upper rafters of this incomplete building. And the bad guy says, "You can't let me go. You won't be able to live with yourself." And then Darkman lets him go to his death, and he looks in the camera and says, "I'm learning to live with a lot of things." And it was just like, whoa. There's a character arc, and it's just kind of like, now you can see. I saw, that's how a storyteller can affect someone, is give someone that kind of an arc.
Right, because the writer there completely pulled the rug out from what the viewer expected.
Right, and then a couple years later, I was reading a trilogy called Eisenhorn by a brilliant author named Dan Abnett. A British gentleman. I met him once, and if you go through those three books, the main character starts off in a certain, very pure right acting sort of way, and at the end of the third book, he does something horrible. We'll just leave it there because I don't want to spoil anything. And as I finished the third book and put it down, I was like, okay, that's great. And then it hit me like a few hours later. I was like, wait a minute, did Eisenhorn actually do that to his longtime friend? I went back and double checked that. Yes, Eisenhorn did indeed do this terrible thing to his old friend, and I was like, and when that happened, I was totally on board with it. I was like, yeah, that's the right thing to do. And that character arc was so subtle over the course of 3 books, where Eisenhorn changes completely, that I didn't even realize it was happening. And I was like, brilliant.
Oh yeah, that's when you know it's good. Mm-hmm. So, did you? At what point did you know? Well, before we go there, so you had this idea that you were fascinated by character growth and character arcs and the way that that writers and storytellers can, for lack of a better word, kind of manipulate our emotions and play with the way we think about people and think about situations and things. At what point did you say, this is something that I want to do? Not just I appreciate this, but, I think I can do this.
It was, do you know Joe Conrath? He has,
yes.
Yeah, he had a blog, and I don't know what it was. I was at work. It was a Saturday. I was going through the internet, and I came across his blog about self-publishing. And I saw this, and I was like, oh, here's how he does it. Oh, there's no more gatekeepers. Oh, that's interesting, because prior to that, I had written a screenplay about the Red Baron, and you're trying to get into Hollywood. There are fewer, harder things in life than trying to get into Hollywood as a writer. And, I wrote a good script. People liked it, but I didn't get anywhere with it. And then I saw, here is a pathway, thank you, Amazon, to put my stories out there for people to read. I'm like, oh, I can do this. And at the time, I was like, well, I just, been in the Army for 10 years. I went to Iraq twice. I should write, Iraq war novels, and people will like those. Not the case. But, at least I got those first couple of books out of my system, and then I realized, oh, okay, with the percentage that Amazon pays and the fact that, I would basically be an entrepreneur, the harder I work and the harder I work in a way that mirrors other people who've had success, I can have that same success. And so far things are going pretty well.
So you spent 10 years in the military. What was it that originally drew you to want to go into the military?
My family has been in the American military since the Revolution. And my mother was in the Air Force, and when I was finishing up high school, we were living in Okinawa, Japan, and I was going to a Department of Defense high school surrounded by military people, and it just kind of like, that's the most natural thing, that I could have done. Being around the military for so many years, I was like, let's just do that again. And I went to West Point, even though I was accepted to the Air Force Academy, because when I was 18, I went through all the medical stuff to get into the academies, and the Air Force said, you will never fly an airplane because you're, colorblind. So 18-year-old logic was, if I can't fly the airplanes, I go into the Army and jump out of them. So,
of course. I'm talk about character.
Yeah, these are the decisions you make when you're 18. So.
Right. You went to Iraq twice.
Right, yep.
Yeah. What did you do there? If you
my
can
first
talk about
tour, I was an artillery officer, and we spent most of that first. It was there for 15 months. The first 12 months were in Baghdad, managing convoys that were going on all over the country, and then dealing with a revolt at the last 3 months, and then. My second tour, I was an intelligence officer, where we were basically riding herd on this militia that had supplanted Al Qaeda and kicked them out of the area. So that was that second tour.
Wow. Being a military kid and kind of growing up in that environment, and your parents being active duty, and then even going to a Department of Defense high school, when you went in and then went to an active war zone, did any of that change your perception about what you thought military life was, or what active duty was? How did that affect you as a person?
It's when there's peacetime military and wartime military are two very different things. And because we talk about there's this pendulum that kind of swings between the two. Like during the peacetime military, people are very concerned about reports and looking good and doing all the right things at the right time. And then it's time to go fight people. And then all of a sudden, people are more concerned about let's make sure our equipment works and people know how to shoot the guns that we give them. So the focus changes dramatically. Based on if your threat is Al Qaeda guys in the next hill over, or the inspector who's coming next week. So, but once we transitioned to wartime activities, the focus was much more clear, and while that was that way, things were easier because it becomes very pragmatic. It's like why are we going to spend time on something that's not useful? Versus peacetime military, it's like, well, we got to look good. So going back and forth, once you've kind of gotten rid of all the extraneous, we're just doing this to look good stuff. When it comes time to do that again, it's kind of like, are you kidding me? That's right. It's that kind of mindset. But going overseas, to Iraq, it's you quickly realize what's important. I mean, when there's times where I was living in a place called Fob Duke in the middle of the frickin' desert. I'm sleeping next to my truck in the middle of a sandstorm and getting shot at the next day. And then, when you've gone through that and then you come back to the States, it's like, oh, my AC is not working great. It's fine. Oh, no, McDonald's is closed. I'll just drive to the next one. It's so once you've been through, a real austere environment and a difficult place like Iraq, when you come back to the United States, things seem a lot easier.
Yeah, I would imagine so. I would think so. When you left the military, and you guys live in Las Vegas now, is that right?
We do. I was working as an intelligence contractor in Arizona, and right as that contract was winding down and had been awarded to someone else who had no interest in hiring me, my books started to sell and quickly supplanted the income I was making as a contractor. So I looked at my lovely wife and said, well, where do we want to live? And we agreed on Vegas because Vegas has everything. I mean, whatever you want, it's here. I mean, I've not to brag, but Mike Tyson and I shop at the same Vons. Okay?
Yeah, right, of course.
I've seen him jogging every once in a while. It's kind of weird, but
that's awesome.
So we love it here in Vegas. So
yeah. What kind of culture shock is that, going from, sleeping next to your truck in the desert in a sandstorm, and then, living in the city, that's kind of regarded as, you talk about New York never sleeps, Vegas really never sleeps.
People from so many time zones don't even bother trying to sleep. I know which one I prefer. It's when I can wake up, it's like, which Gordon Ramsay restaurant do I want to go to for dinner versus, oh boy, Emery Emery Pack C with the, Franken beans or whatever it was at the time. So
Right.
it's, I enjoy being here, and I've not felt that clarion call to like, let's go back to Iraq. No, it's not happening.
Yeah, I bet. So you said that initially you thought that you should write books kind of based on your experience, or at least informed by your experiences, because we all know to write what you know, or that's what's drilled into writers' heads. Write what you know, and so tell me about kind of getting started with that, and what that experience was like for you in writing those first couple of books.
Sure. The first couple of books I wrote were spy military thrillers. The first long book is set in Iraq, and then there's stuff that happens, within the confines of CIA activity. And then, it's four total stories. And I'd been to Iraq for 30 months by that point. Been military intelligence, army, and so I wrote a book, fiction that heavily influenced by all that activity in a fiction setting, and it didn't sell. And the reason is that I had not read that genre growing up. I've read a couple of Tom Clancy books. I did not read all the the big names who write those kinds of stories, and so what I was providing was a story that didn't quite fit what the market wanted for that. And like my first book, there's some dark stuff in there, and that's because this is the stuff that happened in Iraq. It was not a pleasant experience for anybody.
Sure.
But I wasn't giving the story that people wanted, and because I had not read the genre. And looking back now, I could see where my huge mistake was. So, but I still persisted through several novels and built up a small readership that helped me later on. And what I ended up doing is I'm still friends with Russel Blake on Facebook, who's an amazing man. Love him to death.
Sure.
And one day I was kvetching to him on Facebook Messenger. I was like, I barely sell 100 books a month. I suck. And he said, well, have you thought about writing a different genre? And a light bulb goes off in my head, because I had loved Star Wars since before I could walk. I've read Star Trek books, Star Wars books, Warhammer 40,000 books my entire life. Well, not once I could learn to read, that's what I was reading. And I just I've devoured that genre for 30 years. And then I was like, oh well, why don't I write something in the military science fiction genre that I would enjoy and just have fun with it? And that's where we got the Ember War, which has done gangbusters.
Yeah, and that was my introduction to your work, was the Ember War. But I think that is a something that people really need to heed, because I'm pretty sure your thrillers were as authentic and well-informed as any thriller you're going to read, because you were actually, quote, boots on the ground. You had an insight into that probably 90% of thriller writers don't have. Yet, it was not what the market wanted, which is a really strange thing when you think about it. But this whole write what you know thing is not always what you think it is. And maybe write what you know is the thing that you have soaked up like a sponge, for all of your life, like you're talking about with the, sci-fi and military sci-fi stuff. So that's a really interesting part of your story that that fascinates me.
And one question to tell is Tom Clancy, who, despite having passed away many years ago, still puts out a great number of books. He, known for Hunt for Red October, military thrillers, never served a day in uniform his whole life.
Right.
He was a real estate agent in Florida with a library card. And,
right.
And he was able to go and just do open source research, as we call it in Intel, about writing, military thrillers. And it worked. So, as I think he had loved that genre his entire life, and clearly it paid off for him.
Yeah, and had creepy accuracy on a lot of things.
Yeah, there's some people in the Navy who were like, he needs to go to jail, and he just went and said, well, here's where I got it all from the library.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So, so you had this conversation with Russel Blake, a great friend of the show. We love Russell. And so the spark went off to kind of switch gears and write sci-fi. Did you have any hesitation about doing that since you had never written sci-fi before?
I had abandoned anything because at that point I'd written five novels, none of which were selling great. And I went to the Ember War and I said, you know what, I'm just going to have fun with this. And if it sinks like a rock like the other ones, maybe I'll just, do something else. And so, I had committed myself to writing just the fun novel that I wanted to read with the Ember War. And I didn't quite so much, it was just like, let me just get this out. I don't care if it sells. I just get it out and see if maybe I have the mojo or I don't. So, and lucky for me, it caught on.
Well, that's a recurring theme on this show is that there seems to be this thing that happens when you quit trying to please everyone else, or when you finally say, I'm going to write the book that I want to read, it just kind of, things magically kind of fall in place there, that it's something about finding your passion, and that's when the real creativity takes over.
Mm-hmm.
So how long did it take you to write that first Ember Wars book?
I want to say 2 months.
Oh, wow.
And I had, the premise I had was, why haven't we heard from, other alien races out there in the galaxy? And there's a lot of theories, and one of the theories out there was that, every time some species, perks its head up and the galaxy says, hey, I'm over here, something comes over and smashes them. So I said, okay, what if there is this, this horrible group of people who are aliens out there smashing everyone who shows up in the galaxy? I'm like, okay, all right, how do you fight that, and how do you win? And then that was the problem I tried to figure out for the first Ember War, and then the whole rest of the series.
Did you envision it as being a series to begin with?
I did. I mean, there was a point where I sat down and okay, book one is this, and then here are the high points, and then this was, I knew that the last scene of the Ember War when I first started the first book. I knew the last scene in the series, before I started the first book.
Wow. That's intense. You were not a novice in coming to the Ember War. You had written, I think you said 5 full books.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think you learned from those first books, the thrillers and the military stuff that you wrote, that made it easier to get into the Ember War, and when you kind of found the thing that you were passionate about, what had you learned from those previous books that allowed you to really excel at this one?
I think what it was is pacing.
Mm-hmm.
And this may not be the answer anyone was expecting. But anytime I look at a story and I get to a scene, the question is always, can I take this out? And when I'm writing a book and it's like, there's this great scene, but does it help with character? Does it help with the plot? If not, it gets taken out. So when it comes to, writing, any of my stories, it's very, I like to liken it to a roller coaster. You're going through the whole thing and then until you're done, and I have your attention the whole time. So it's getting that pacing down, I think, has helped a lot because I have people who leave reviews say I picked it up in the afternoon, I didn't stop reading until 3 a.m, and I'm like, oh, I'm doing something right, thank goodness.
I had a similar experience when reading the first Ember War book. Yep. A lot of times I'll lay in bed at night with my Kindle, and I'll just go through the Kindle store and I'll look for stuff to read, and I said, you know what, I've been meaning to pick up one of Richard's books. Like, let me grab this one. And the next thing I know, it's like 2:00 in the morning, and I'm like, damn you, Richard. And
no apologies.
Yeah, no apologies. None expected. So it took you about 2 months to write this. Were there any challenges to writing science fiction as opposed to things that needed to be, more or less real, so to speak? And how do you juggle the kind of the science fiction fantastical stuff with keeping people anchored in the story?
It's for me, it's very important to be consistent with your rules. Like,
Okay.
and for the Ember War, a big thing is you cannot go faster than the speed of light. You can jump through wormholes, but moving at a certain below C is a restriction, and so you had to keep that restriction going through everything. And then it's like, okay, how do they shoot people, and how do the ships work, and what about gravity? And then just establishing those base rules and then not breaking them is important. And if you have some tech, every once in a while I have lightning in space, and I get some reviews. People say you can't have lightning. As long as I'm consistent, it's no one seems to matter too much, or no one seems to get too angry. And then as for the science fiction, because I set most of the story 60 years in the future, so all the tech I had to have was largely probable. So railguns and a little bit of anti-grav or gravity plating. So nothing too outlandish for the next 60 years. So it was keeping the tech believable, reachable, and kind of in the forefront for people who know technology. So if I reference Tesla every once in a while, for the cars, people will be on board with that. And then also for science fiction, when it was something that's set in the kind of near future, what happened in those 60 years prior to the beginning book starts and then the main plot kicks off. And it was like, okay, well, there's a World War III, and there's this, that, and the other thing. And then having, that background be a part of the story and just kind of, simmering beneath, but not to the point where, somebody has a 5-page info dump on when the Chinese invaded Australia.
Right. Did setting the story in the somewhat near future, was that easier or harder for world building, in your opinion?
Setting it in the near future wasn't too bad because I have set the whole power structure of the planet, and so. But when I had said that the Chinese are a world power now, it's not too hard for people to believe. And then, so it wasn't too hard. It was just that I had changed things enough that readers could believe it. If you look back to 60 years ago, you go back to 1950, and then you try to describe the world today, I don't think people in the 50s would be, too surprised. They may be like, "Oh, communism failed. That's good," but you describe everything else, people would nod their head and like, "Yeah, that's plausible." So. Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point, because you think. Half a century, a lot can happen, and a lot did happen in our previous half century, but it kind of makes logical sense when you look back on kind of the progression of technology. So yeah, I get that. One thing I talked to Jason Onspach and Nick Cole about recently when we were talking about their new blockbuster series that's just going crazy right now was bringing the fun back into science fiction, and I really related to what you said about the kinds of stuff you've read growing up and loving Star Wars before you could walk, and there seemed to be, at least for me, there's a certain type of science fiction that I really love, and it's really kind of based in adventure stories and kind of the belief and the hope that humanity is going to win out in the end. But they're great adventure stories, and I got that same kind of feeling, from your books, is that you dropped me right into the action, and you built characters that I cared about, and I wanted to go on a trip with them. Is that something that you consciously set out to do, and did you have a certain tone that you were going for?
It was the tone I was going for. It was more that humanity is inherently good and will do the inherently good thing as long as they can. And there's a lot of back and forth in between for the Ember War about doing what's morally and ethically right versus what you have to do to survive. And there's a conflict between the character Mark Ibarra, who's sort of in the background manipulating everything for the sole purpose of having humanity survive long term. And then you have these other characters who they have their own agency, and they say this is the right thing to do. And like there was for the third book of the series, Blood of Heroes,
the captain of the main starship, his name is Valder. He has this key piece of technology that Earth needs to survive, but instead of taking it right back to Earth, he goes to save this other planet that's being attacked. So, there's a little bit of that back and forth of, risking, everything for the sake of doing what's right. And there's a lot of that goes back and forth. And I watched a lot of Star Trek, and Star Trek has a lot of great morality plays to it. And I wanted to put some of that in there. And then also for tone, there's a lot of serious business that happens in the Ember War. The very first couple of chapters, 99% of the population is wiped out. But we have some characters who are there to inject a little bit of levity. There's one character named Standish, who's modeled off a number of soldiers I had who were thieves and criminals, but they still meant well. And so
right.
I have Standish characters. I have other people who are there to lighten the tone a bit, because if it's just serious and oppressive and oh no the whole time, it gets boring. But if you can still have all that, but then you lighten it up a little bit, where if you just at some point you have someone say, "There's going to be some kind of monster down there that's going to eat my face," isn't there? And then it keeps the reader engaged. It's like, okay, it's not super boring. It's not the news,
Right.
And
right.
People have enough, serious stuff in their Facebook feed and on news that it's like, I'm not going to give them that. I'm going to give them an action story so they forget about that.
Yeah. Well, and that's a great thing about fiction, and especially science fiction or fantasy, is that when you write thrillers, and I do love thrillers. I love, the political machinations and all of that stuff. And I love a good conspiracy. Those make for great reading. But a lot of writers come with their own, I don't want to say agenda. That's not really the word I'm looking for, but they come with a certain view on things, especially when you're dealing with the real world as it is right now. People are going to be segmented into camps, and when you start talking geopolitics, people are going to approach that in very specific ways. But when you remove that stuff and you take the story, several miles up into space, and you start dealing with aliens from another planet, you get to really explore how we interact with each other and how we deal with threats and all of that in a non-threatening way. That people can kind of take off their partisan blinders, if you will, and kind of look at things differently. Is that something that you ever think about?
It's Isaac Asimov said that any story can be made science fiction, and you just have to put a mask on it. And it's so when I write, there's that old test. You go to a room, people, and you say, "Who here has an attitude?" And everyone has to raise their hand. So everyone has their own political mindset about everything. But with writing science fiction, you could have modern things, but in the form of a parable.
Yeah.
And when you do it as a parable, people's immediate, that visceral reaction of, you're saying something about Trump or you're saying something about Clinton, that goes away. Right. And if you put a mask on it, then you can make people think about whatever topic of discussion you want the story to be about, and people don't have that immediate that kind of animal brain of, I'm under a threat when they read it.
Right. Exactly. And, there's power in parables. There are certain religions that have been wrestling with, parables for thousands of years. And it's one of those things that can never be fully resolved, because there's always a new way to look at it and something new to learn. So I like that analogy. Mm-hmm. For sure. So how many books are in the Ember Wars series?
The main story is 9 books, and I kept it. 9 books seems like a lot, but sometimes it feels like this is too many. But so there's 9 books there, and then the story, the universe continues in the Iron Dragoons series, and that has 2 books that's out, and the 3rd book should be out next month or early November.
Wow. At what point did you? So Russell told you, why don't you try something different, and you did. At what point did you realize you were getting traction?
I think it was when I sold like 30 books in one day,
nice.
Which is a record for me.
Yeah.
And I was like, what the heck is going on here? And then, like, the first time, the book crossed, the total sales for the day crossed 100, I went and woke my wife up, which is a mistake. Don't ever do that. And told her, like, honey, we sold 100 books, and she told me to go back to bed. And so it was when that started happening. Then I remember the first review I ever got for the Ember War. I think the title was "An Undiscovered Gem" on Amazon. I was like, "This is not my mother. What's going on here? Who wrote this? A complete stranger. I couldn't believe it."
Oh, that's amazing. So, was this when just one book was out?
This was the first book. Yeah.
Okay.
It came out about a little over 2 years ago. Okay.
And did you, since you already knew that it was going to be a series, were you newly motivated to get on it and get those books out?
No, I screwed up. So I wrote the Ember War, and when I was writing, I sent it off to the editor, and then I thought, well, maybe it doesn't work. Let me try to write this kind of Eastern Asian romance set in space. And so, it's the book is now called The Queen of Sidonia, which is a lovely story. People who've read it, I wrote that book under a different title and under a pen name, and then put that out right as the first book came out, and somehow thinking, so instead of writing the second book, I did something else, which was a huge mistake. But it may have worked out, because then I wrote The Ruins of Anthelos, the second book. And when that book 2 came out, it came out right as Kindle Unlimited changed. Because they went from you read 10%, you get this amount of money, to you get paid per page.
Right.
And that's
about a year and a half ago? Year ago?
It's about 2 years.
Okay.
Year and a half, 2 years. And for whatever reason, The Ruins of Anthelos kicked in right as people were getting into Kindle Unlimited 2, version 2. I guess Amazon did a push.
Right.
So both my books, both those first 2 books in the series, were doing great. So that there was a delay in between book 1 and 2 worked out in the end. But the smart thing would have just been to go write book number.
Right. And maybe book 3 would have been out then to take advantage of KU too. Yeah. I got you. Science fiction is, in military sci-fi especially, seem to be one of those genres that's just really primed for that delivery method. That it's I don't know what it is. It gets prominent placement in the Kindle store, and there seems to be a really on fire reader base for those. What did you learn about switching to that genre that surprised you?
It's the thing about military science fiction is that it is underserved. Baen will put out one military sci-fi book a month. Tor, and I think Baen also does not put a lot of their ebooks on Amazon. Sorry, Baen, they have their own ebook store. Tor does not put out much military science fiction that often. And one of the best places for all military science fiction online right now is a place called Black Library with Warhammer 40,000. And they have their own ebook store separate from Amazon. They're moving stuff in. So for military science fiction, that there is not a lot of new titles coming in. But there is a voracious reader base.
Yes.
Who grew up like I did with, Star Wars and Star Trek, and who can't get enough.
Right.
So I can't write these books fast enough to satisfy everyone.
Yeah. Explain to everyone exactly what makes a book military sci-fi.
It's you have to have military things in a military manner. So you need to have ranks, people in uniform. So you need to have, and then of course your science fiction aspect of where it's the art of the possible in at some point in the future. And now there's some books that they'll get a little cross genres, like Armor by John Steakley is military science fiction. I don't think anyone discusses that, but there's also a big regular science fiction story put into that book.
Yeah.
So, and it helps if you're going to have a military science fiction story to put a spaceship on the cover. And
yes,
for whatever reason, that seems to be that's how you do it.
Well, it's the calling card. It's like the secret hand signal that we flash to other people. Like, this is where it's at right here.
Right.
Not all writers have an illustrious military career like you did, and you talked about how Tom Clancy, was able to do open source research to inform the kind of thrillers that he wrote. What would you recommend for writers who don't have the background that you do, and how they might be able to get in and appreciate the genre, but maybe also try their hand at writing for it?
I would say read autobiographies written by people who've been through war.
Okay.
There's With the Old Breach by E.B. Sledge, and you get the very, that visceral soldier at the bottom level in the mud story from someone who was in the mud there. But I would say read autobiographies that are written decades after a conflict is over with, because then there's no more politics. There's no one's trying to be protective of anyone. So you read those older autobiographies of soldiers, and that'll give you a good feeling for what it's like to be in that kind of a fight. Because a lot of people, they write soldiers and they're all perfect. Everyone is very they love mother and apple pie, and they're all very good reasonings. When I was in the Army, I had soldiers who were criminals, and joined the Army to get because the judge said you do this or prison, and people carried on some of their older habits with them when they joined the Army. So it's learning that soldiers aren't perfect all the time, and they like to curse and do young virile man things when they have money. That happens. Okay, it's
right.
So, but also if you're going to write military science fiction, set your rules up and be consistent, and that's important. And I grew up reading Jane's Defense Weekly about weapon systems, and that was helpful.
Sure. So when you got to the end of the Ember War Saga, the first 9 books, you said that Iron Dragoons is picking up from there. That's the book that just won the Dragon Award this year. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
But where did that book come from? And how did you decide that you wanted to kind of branch out and continue the story, but in a little different way?
Right. In the Ember War, there's a group of characters called the Ironhearts, who they're armor soldiers. They're inside these giant suits of armor, and they're very, very popular throughout the whole series. So writing a story about more armor soldiers was a pretty easy one, because I knew it would be an easy sell to my audience. It's like, hey, you guys, you all love Elias. Here's more of that kind of story. But then it was also the basic training story is very common throughout military science fiction, and because it offers a great way for new readers to get into the series, because they're following along with a young soldier who has to learn everything too. So while this is the 10th book in the Ember War universe, I have made it a basic training story, so everyone who's new to the series doesn't have that high of a bar to get over to enjoy it.
Right. And if you enjoyed this book, if this is your entry to the universe, you've got so much more that you can go back and immerse yourself in. And then when you come back to the Terran Armor Corps series, you'll probably be like, oh, I feel like I've already know this world, so mm-hmm. it's a great, I love the kind of spin-off and the different series that add, more texture to the world, if you will. Yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, if it was tricky to write, because if you've read all 9 Ember War books and you get to Iron Dragoons, you're going to be nodding furiously as you're going through the book, because you'll catch some of the references and you know who these people are that they're being talked about. So it's great. If you haven't read the Ember War books, you can come into Iron Dragoons with fresh eyes and still, this is still a great story. So, it's kind of, I try to make it as win-win as possible, and it's tricky. It really is tricky.
Right. There are 2 books in that series so far. What do you have planned for it?
It should be 5 books. It might be more, because sometimes when I know where that whole series is going. But sometimes I'll be, writing a book and then, here's this other story that you just kind of emerges naturally. Like when I was writing the Ember War, the 8th book, The Crucible, kind of emerged on its own. I was like, okay, this is a story that has to be told. And could that happen again with the Iron Dragoons books? Yes, it could. So the plan right now is for 5 or 6, but it might get bigger. But I won't let it go too long. So.
You talked about that military sci-fi is very underserved, and there's a very hungry fan base for those. How do you keep a long-running series like this going and keep the tension high so that you're constantly having something to give these people that are just waiting for the next books to come out? How do you keep this long series going, and how do you keep it interesting and exciting?
It's for every book, I try to, I know what the question the plot is asking. Like for the second book in the series, The Ruins of Athlos, the question is, what is in those ruins? And so during the course of that book, you get that answer. So you get closure. The reader is like, oh, good, I know. They feel good about reading the story. But then you also ask the question for the next book. By the end of that story. So people read and they get closure, and then they get enticed to, but what's going to happen next? So, and that keeps people interested, because if you have a real strong closeout, right? The story is done. People can be like, oh, I'm done. And they can walk away and go find something else. And, even at the end of book 9 of the Ember War, there were unanswered questions. And, some of those were, I put those in there to give me trapdoors in case other series didn't work out and come back to the Ember War. But, so there's always, the main question gets answered, but then the next question gets asked in every story.
Right. Do you, how far in the future do you look at your writing schedule? So you've got the Ember War, you've closed it out, now you've got the Iron Dragoon, which is the beginning of another series. Are you thinking like a large scale, more books and series in this world?
I am. I am working with 2 amazing co-authors for more Ember War series, and those will be out towards the end of this year. And then also, I have about the next year planned out for, this is when this book has to hit. I have to write the story for this anthology, et cetera, et cetera. So I plan about a year out of what's coming up next.
Yeah. At what point in your writing and publishing did you realize that this thing is more than just a hobby? This is a serious endeavor, and it's going to require me to take it seriously and pursue it seriously.
When it became my main source of income.
Nice.
And because when the old contractor job petered out, and then the books replaced that income, and it's like, oh, okay, this is my job now. And looking at it as a job is important for anyone who wants to write full time. Because I can't, I realize I'm not in the point where I can just go, I'm going to go away for 4 months and do nothing. No, because Amazon's algorithm works in such a way that if I don't put something out every 60 to 90 days, they won't, I'll stop making money, and then people go hungry. So we can't have that.
How has it changed your creative process, that you do have to look at this, at least in some point, in some part, as a business? I know that doesn't change you as a writer, but it might change your process a little bit. Have you noticed that you have to adjust the way you approach stories since this has made such a transition for you? I realize that my books are a certain kind of way, and every artist is like this. I mean, there's John Williams, who did the score for hundreds of movies. You can get to the point where you can just hear something new from him and realize, oh, it's a John Williams. And so I realize that my kind of books are a certain way, and I have my voice, and it goes through a certain way. So when I'm writing new stories, people enjoy what I'm giving them. So the important part for me is not to do something radically different for the sake of art. It's never about me writing to please myself. It's me writing to entertain my reader.
And at the point where I know, like, I'm just going to write, you know, speculative fiction about a 16-year-old girl who loves a cloud, and I realize I'm going to fail miserably. So, and, you know, I have my audience, and I know what they like. I'm going to keep giving it to them. And I joke about someday I'm going to write these 800-page books about Napoleon's marshals. And while I was a military history major, I would love to write a 800-page book about Davout and the Battle of, you know, Jena Auerstadt. But if I did that, I would sell 50 copies, and that's all. And, you know, to the 50 people who read that. So, you know, it's like, I know, you know, I have my readers. They expect certain things from a story from me, and I'm going to keep giving it to them. So,
but there is a balance, isn't there? That yes, you're writing to entertain your readers, absolutely, and you know that's important and it's crucial. But at the same time, if you don't care about the story, you know, it's going to show through in your writing. So first off, before you can entertain them, in a way, you have to make sure that this is something that entertains you and that you care about. Granted, you need both of those, because if it just entertains you and nobody else gives a crap, then, you know, so there is kind of a fine line to walk there, isn't there?
There is, and what I like to read is there needs to be a moral gray area that people don't approve of. And like one of the best TV episodes of TV ever was a Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode called In the Pale Moonlight, where Captain Sisko abandons all of his moral and ethical, you know, Starfleet officerness to save the Federation. And so I like to have, you know, stories where their core beliefs get challenged, and some of them go one way, some of them go the other way. And as long as I keep and people, you know, if it gives people enough, you know, time to go, I wonder if that's the right thing to do, then, you know, I'm doing well, because it's stimulating thought beyond of something exploding on the page.
Well, and it keeps your writing from being preachy. You know, if you give the reader a chance to kind of work through that on their own, you know, you may know where the characters are going and what their motivations are, but it's a great way to help people kind of look at things in a different light.
And people appreciate that, because, you know, and then I also provide the explosions and the pew pew and the funny jokes every once in a while. So right. I'm trying to try a well-rounded story. You know, like you give a little something for everybody to appreciate. Yeah,
and you know, the presence of a little levity and the well-placed joke. You know, Han Solo was a member of the crew, you know, on Star Wars for a reason. You know, we needed him to, you know, to ensure that we didn't take things quite so seriously sometimes, and that cannot be overstated. The you know, when you're writing serious stuff, give people a chance to let off a little bit of that steam. Yeah. Richard, where can people find you if they, you know, want to follow your work and pick up this, you know, this great work that you're doing?
The best place is go to Amazon and just type in Richard Fox, and I will pop right up. And then come over to Facebook at Richard Fox Author, and it's always a party there. And that's the easiest place to find me, is on Facebook.
Always a party there. Richard, it's been fascinating to talk to you. I'm glad you came on the show. And congratulations again on your Dragon Award.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How often are you publishing now?
I try to keep something out every 60 to 90 days.
Okay. So if someone is just coming to your work, so far they've got 11, I think, of your military sci-fi to get into, and by the time they've worked through all of those, you'll have new stuff coming out.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on the show, Richard.
Our pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Tune in for new episodes every Tuesday and Friday. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Hedwig slipped into David's den, the circular reading room. A ladder of crude rungs protruded from the wall, remnant of its days as a grain silo. He pulled himself upward, rung by rung, until the bookcases and sofas were far below. Even if he fell and died, he didn't really care anymore. No, he did care. He couldn't die yet. She had to die first. That would make their divorce final, if she wanted it so much. Darkness enveloped him. He reached the top of the ladder and stepped off onto a catwalk of black mesh, lit only by the faint light of the 4 square windows that encircled the turret. From this perch he could see the exit she would use. He felt like an assassin, like Lee Harvey Oswald in the window of the Texas schoolbook depository. But he wouldn't use a rifle. No, rifles leave evidence. Rifles can be produced in court. Rifles can miss. He pulled back a shroud of burlap and opened the cardboard box he'd stashed up here earlier that day. He reached into it and withdrew the only murder weapon, the only magic bullet a Van Brunt could ever need. The gold lantern flashed in the moonlight. He held it up to the window. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, he thought, and then it's time for a midnight ride. But it won't be Paul Revere. No, not Paul Revere at all. He found the oyster knife at last. He lay his cupped palm sideways over the vent. Don't get blood on your Armani. And stabbed the blade into his palm. The blood came hot. He dripped it into the lantern, where the skull of the horseman waited to sip it like nectar. The reliquary glowed, and an incantation in Old Dutch appeared, shining from within the metal. It was time. Hedwig bent and whispered into the vents. Rise, headless, and ride. The letters vanished, and a cold white light burst from the thing. The skull wasn't just a skull anymore. It had gestated. Capillaries clung to it the way fine hair clings to the crown of a newborn. A thick, carotid artery moved with snake-like undulation, drinking blood from the pool at the base, pulling it upwards to circulate through scarlet vessels, through twisting coils, slurping the liquid greedily, the way little Zeph used to slurp strawberry Nesquik through a crazy straw. The blood pulsed and pushed into the nose, into the eyes, into the hollow cavity within the skull. But was it hollow still? Hedwig didn't think so. He felt a mind growing there, something with a will to challenge his own. He fixed his gaze to the twin caverns of its eye sockets, speaking slowly and deliberately. Jessica Bridge. The death's head grin broadened somehow, and a thread of black and green liquid, shiny as a horsefly's wings, trickled from the gap of a missing eye tooth. Only Jessica Bridge. Do you understand? He shook the lantern. Do you understand? The face lurched forward and struck the glass, leaving a red splash there. It wobbled and settled, smiling and nodding. Jessica Bridge, hissed the face. Yes. Hedwig raised the lantern a little. Jessica Bridge. The red face tipped backwards and the jaw cracked wide. Hedwig recoiled. Something pink and wet writhed inside that mouth. The nub of a new tongue, salivating as if it could taste the name. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge.